Welcome back to my YouTube channel. My son looked me in the eye one morning, his voice cold as stone. "Mom," he said, "I'm tired of you. So is my wife." I stood there in the kitchen, the same one where I had once cooked his favorite meals, where his laughter used to echo as a child. Now it was silent. The warmth had long gone cold. It was my house. I had bought it with the savings of a lifetime, thinking it would be a home for all of us, a place where love and laughter would never fade. But somewhere between their growing ambitions and my growing age, I became invisible. They treated me like an obligation, not a mother. My every word was met with sighs, my every step an inconvenience. Even my chair at the dinner table began to feel like borrowed space. One night, as I sat alone, I asked myself a question that changed everything. Why am I begging for love in a house I built with my own hands? Tears could have drowned me that night, but instead they washed away my fear. I realized sometimes silence is the most powerful teacher. So instead of crying, I planned quietly. Not revenge in the cruel sense, but justice wrapped in dignity. A month later, while they were away for a weekend, I made my move. I called my lawyer. The papers were ready. The house was sold. Every brick, every memory, every tear-stained corner that once held my hope. When they returned, they stood outside their own gate, shocked to see the locks changed and the nameplate gone. My son called my phone, his voice trembling. "Mom, what happened?" I simply said, "You said you were tired of me." So I decided to rest, somewhere I'm welcome. And then I hung up, peacefully. I moved to a small coastal town where mornings smelled of sea breeze instead of bitterness. I started teaching children how to read, sharing stories of kindness and resilience. I learned to smile again, this time for myself. And here's what I learned. Family isn't made by blood alone. It's made by respect, by love freely given, not demanded. If you ever feel unwanted in a place you built with love, remember, your worth isn't measured by how others treat you, but by how you choose to rise. Walk away if you must. Sometimes the locks you change on your past are the keys to your freedom. The pain of rejection doesn't come like a storm. It arrives quietly, one cold glance at a time, one harsh word that slices deeper than you expected. That morning when my son said those words, "Mom, I'm tired of you. So is my wife," I felt something inside me crumble. The house fell silent, but inside me 1,000 echoes roared. I had raised him with tenderness, carried his dreams on my shoulders, and celebrated his every victory as if it were my own. Now standing there, I felt like a stranger in my own story. The walls that once carried photographs of laughter seemed to turn away, embarrassed by what they were witnessing. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He simply said it like a statement of fact, as if he were discussing the weather. That calm cruelty hurt more than anger ever could. His wife avoided my eyes, her hands folded, her face distant. I could sense she had been waiting for this moment, for him to finally say what she'd been thinking for months. I was no longer his mother in their eyes. I was an old obligation, a duty to endure, not a person to love. I looked around the house that I had bought with every saved penny from years of sacrifice. I had dreamed it would be a haven for all of us, a place where my family could grow together in warmth and laughter. But instead, it had turned into a place where my presence was a shadow, something they tolerated until it became inconvenient. The teacups I used, the seat I preferred, even the gentle hum of my morning prayers began to annoy them. I started to shrink into corners, lowering my voice, walking softer, trying not to disturb the peace that was never mine anymore. Every night, I would sit by the window and wonder when love had turned into pity. I replayed my son's childhood in my mind, the scraped knees I had bandaged, the late nights I waited for him to come home from school events, the pride I felt seeing him in his first suit. How could the same boy, once so full of affection, look at me now with eyes that saw only burden? It felt like losing him all over again, only this time he was still there, breathing, but gone. In those moments of quiet heartbreak, I realized that rejection from a stranger wounds the ego, but rejection from your own child breaks the soul. Yet, I sat there in silence, because sometimes words are too small to carry that kind of pain. In the days that followed, I found myself moving through the house like a ghost, present but unseen. Their laughter drifted from the living room, but it no longer included me. I could hear them whispering behind closed doors, making plans, deciding things about the house, about life, as if I were just a tenant staying too long. Every sound in that place reminded me that I had become unnecessary. And yet, I stayed, not because I was weak, but because I still hoped. Hoped that one morning my son would walk in and see the sorrow in my eyes, realize what he had done, and take me in his arms like he used to. But days passed, and that moment never came. It was in those long, quiet afternoons that a realization began to form, not out of anger, but out of exhaustion. I had spent my entire life pouring love into people who no longer saw its value. I had given everything, my time, my care, my patience, believing that love would be enough to keep me safe. But love without respect is just dependency wearing a kind face. I was beginning to understand that what they called family was not about love anymore. It was about convenience. They wanted my house, my money, my support, but not me. Each morning, I would wake up early and make breakfast, only to find untouched plates when I returned to the kitchen. They ate elsewhere, laughing, talking, living a life that no longer needed my presence. The little gestures that once meant warmth, sharing tea, sitting together in the evening, were gone. In their place was distance, quiet resentment, and a strange politeness that felt worse than anger. It was as if I had become invisible, erased one small act at a time. One evening, I overheard my son say, "She'll get used to it. Mom's always dramatic." And that was when it struck me. He didn't see me as someone with feelings. He saw me as a problem that needed managing. That sentence became a mirror. I finally saw my reality without the haze of love or hope. I had raised a man who had forgotten empathy, and that truth was harder to face than his words. That night, I sat in my room and looked at the photo frames on my dresser. My son as a child grinning with chocolate on his face. My late husband standing proudly beside us. Those faces had once been my reason to keep going. But as I traced my fingers over the glass, I realized that clinging to memories was no longer helping me heal. It was keeping me chained. And that's when I decided, if they no longer saw my worth, I would start seeing it myself. I would stop waiting to be valued in a place that had already forgotten my name in love's language. The turning point came quietly, not with a burst of anger or some grand moment of defiance, but in the stillness of a late night when I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house, and realized I had two choices: to keep existing as a shadow in my own home, or to reclaim the woman I used to be. I had spent years giving, nurturing, forgiving, and in return I had been made to feel like a burden. But that night, something inside me shifted. I understood that my tears no longer had the power to change hearts that had already turned cold. I began to see things differently. Every hurtful word, every dismissive glance, every act of neglect became fuel, not for hatred, but for awakening. I thought about how many women, mothers, and elders endure this quiet kind of exile, living among their own families yet feeling completely alone. We are taught to tolerate, to sacrifice, to stay silent. But silence, I realized, was no longer kindness. It was surrender. And I was done surrendering. I decided that my next move would not come from anger, but from clarity. I wasn't going to yell, argue, or plead for respect. I was going to take back my dignity in a way they would never forget. I began to plan quietly, with a calmness that surprised even me. It wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. If they saw me as nothing more than an old woman taking up space, I would remind them, without a word, of what true strength looks like. Over the next few days, I watched them, listened to them, and observed how they spoke about me as if I weren't there. Their indifference became my teacher. I learned to detach, to stop reacting, to simply note everything while preparing silently. I started sorting through my papers, finding the original documents of the house, the deed, the receipts, the proof that it was mine. Each document felt like a fragment of my forgotten power returning to me. When I held those papers in my hands, I felt something stir in my heart, a memory of the woman who had built a life from nothing, who had faced loss and still stood tall. That woman had been buried under years of love, guilt, and fear, but now she was waking up. I remembered the long hours I had worked, the sacrifices I had made, and the pride I once felt in being independent. I realized I didn't need anyone's permission to take back control, so I made a decision. I would not cry anymore. I would not explain or justify myself. I would act decisively, quietly, and with purpose. My revenge wouldn't be cruel. It would be poetic. I would show them that the woman they dismissed still had strength, wit, and ownership. And when the time came, they would understand that they had never been living in their house. They had been living in mine. The day I set my plan in motion felt like any other day to them, but to me it was the beginning of my freedom. I woke up before dawn, made myself a cup of tea, and sat by the window as the sun began to rise. The light spilled gently over the walls, touching every corner of the house I had built, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel sadness. I felt peace. I had made up my mind. I wasn't going to shout, accuse, or demand an apology. I was going to take back what was mine, with quiet dignity. I went through every room, gathering my belongings, touching each item with a kind of final tenderness. This wasn't just a home anymore. It had become a lesson. I found the title deed, the property papers, and the keys, the symbols of ownership that I had nearly forgotten belonged to me. The house had been under my name since the day I bought it, back when I believed that securing a home for my son's future was the most loving thing I could do. How ironic that the same house had become a cage for my heart. When they left for a weekend getaway, laughing as they carried their luggage to the car, I stood by the door and watched. They didn't notice me, just like always. It was almost poetic, how easily they left behind the woman who had made that home possible. As their car disappeared around the corner, I felt a strange mixture of sorrow and liberation. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was powerful. It was mine. That afternoon, I called my lawyer, a kind man who had helped me years ago when I first purchased the property. When I told him what I wanted, there was a long pause on the line. Then he said softly, "Are you sure, Mrs. Malik?" I smiled. "I've never been more sure of anything," I replied. The process was surprisingly simple. The documents were all in my name, no disputes, no legal obstacles. Within days, the sale was finalized. A young couple, newly married, had fallen in love with the house. Their faces lit up when they saw it, their voices filled with dreams. It reminded me of a time when love still lived within those walls. That was when I knew I had made the right choice. Before leaving, I took one last walk through every room. The living room where my son had taken his first steps. The kitchen where I used to hum while cooking his favorite dishes. The small garden where I had planted roses that still bloomed faithfully every season. Each space held a memory, but none of them held me anymore. I whispered a quiet goodbye, not to the house, but to the version of myself that had stayed too long waiting to be seen. When they returned 2 days later, I wasn't there. The locks were changed, the nameplate gone, and another family's laughter had begun to fill the space. My phone rang again and again, first from my son, then from his wife. I let it ring. Finally, I picked up. His voice trembled, filled with disbelief. "Mom, what happened?" I took a deep breath and said calmly, "You said you were tired of me, so I decided to rest somewhere I'm wanted." Before he could respond, I hung up. There were no tears this time, no guilt. Just quiet freedom. I moved into a small seaside apartment the next day. The air smelled of salt and beginnings. For the first time in years, I woke up without walking on eggshells. I made tea for one and watched the waves roll in, each one whispering the same truth. Letting go is not revenge, it's rebirth. Life after that moment felt like stepping into sunlight after years in a dim room. At first, the silence was unfamiliar, too soft, too still. I would wake up expecting to hear doors closing, footsteps rushing, voices murmuring from another room. But there was only the sound of the ocean outside my window and the cry of gulls cutting through the morning sky. It felt strange, almost fragile, this peace I had chosen. Yet, as the days passed, it began to settle into me like a long-forgotten song returning to memory. I started to rediscover myself in small, quiet ways. I began taking long walks along the shore at dawn, feeling the cool sand between my toes, watching the waves erase footprints as if teaching me how to let go. I met people, kind, gentle souls, who didn't know my past, didn't see me as a burden or a name tied to someone else's story. They saw me for who I was, a woman learning to live again. I started volunteering at a local school, helping children learn to read. Their laughter filled the empty corners of my heart, the ones that once echoed with disappointment. Each time one of them smiled up at me, I felt a small piece of myself come back to life. There were moments when loneliness would try to creep in, whispering reminders of what I had lost. But then I would remind myself, I hadn't lost anything that truly belonged to me. What I had done was reclaim something far more precious, my self-worth. I realized that love should never require you to disappear. It should never ask you to silence your spirit just to be tolerated. For years, I thought endurance was the mark of strength. Now I knew that walking away, choosing yourself, takes far greater courage. Sometimes, as I sat on the balcony watching the sunset melt into the sea, I would think of my son. Not with anger anymore, but with a quiet understanding. He hadn't learned how to love without conditions, and perhaps I had taught him that by loving him too unconditionally. But life has its own way of teaching what we cannot. One day, he would remember, and maybe then he'd understand what true respect looks like. I no longer waited for that moment. It wasn't mine to chase anymore. I filled my new home with things that made me smile. Books, plants, music. I danced while cooking, laughed out loud at old movies, and spent evenings writing in a journal about the small joys I'd found that day. It was healing disguised as simplicity. The world outside had changed, but inside, I was becoming whole again. I realized that revenge had never been the goal. It was never about punishment. It was about liberation. I didn't need to hurt them to heal myself. All I needed was to walk away from the space that had stopped seeing me and build a new one that did. And so, my story became a quiet revolution, proof that even when love turns cold, dignity can still burn bright. That sometimes, closing the door behind you isn't the end of your story. It's the beginning of the one you were always meant to write. In the end, I learned that peace doesn't always come wrapped in forgiveness or reconciliation. It often comes when you finally stop waiting to be understood. My journey wasn't about teaching anyone a lesson. It was about remembering who I was before life tried to make me small. The day I walked away, I didn't lose a home. I found myself. Now when I look back, I see everything clearly. The pain, the rejection, the heartbreak, they weren't endings. They were doorways. Every tear I shed watered the roots of the woman I became. Stronger, wiser, free. Sometimes life demands that we close a chapter, even when our hearts still ache for what's inside it. But in doing so, we make space for new beginnings, ones built not on obligation, but on choice. And if anyone were to ask me today what revenge truly means, I would smile and say, it's not about making others suffer. It's about living so fully, so freely, that those who doubted your worth are forced to see what they lost. Because the greatest victory isn't in returning pain, it's in walking away with grace and never looking back.